What's the opposite of competition? Well, kind of. If you're not competing against some cooperation, to work with somebody, okay? And so this idea of cooperation versus competition was what Ward suggested was the missing element that Spencerism ignored, that cooperation could lead to success as much as competition. And so therein might be another value. Now, there was another guy who came out with some theories about economics, and of course, by the way, for cooperation, what kind of groups are going to find the idea of cooperation being a key to success more attractive? Okay, the poor, labor, and because eventually we'll see, like unions, right? Okay, so this idea of cooperation perhaps being a different key. So we're going to see different kinds of ideas about that. Now, there's another guy who, and he wasn't a theorist in any way, okay, not a theorist, but nonetheless his name becomes associated with an American ideal. It was a writer by the name of Horatio Alger. Horatio Alger published a series of very popular books. They were extremely popular. As actual literature, they sucked. They were horrible books, okay? They were awful, badly written. I actually have read part of one. I can't even remember the title. It's so bad. I actually was in a rare bookstore and nearly bought one, and I just thought, oh, I can't waste my money. But Horatio Alger's books. Have anybody here actually ever read a romance novel? Anybody willing to admit they've ever read a romance novel? Okay, so romance novel, okay. And if you read a romance novel, aren't romance novels basically all the same novel? Okay, they're all the same thing. Basically, you have a bare-chested guy on the cover, holding girl angled with her arched back, okay, and her titties falling out of her clothes, whatever it is. And he can be dressed as a pirate, he can be a vampire, he can be whatever, he could be a guy in a western hat. It's all the same picture. And the books are all the same book, right? In fact, I actually have a friend who writes romance novels. Her name is Nina Romberg, but she wrote under the name Jane Archer for her romance novels. And she told me that when you would submit to some of these companies, they actually had, like, on page 30, you had your first kiss. On page 75, you had to have your first bare breast. And you actually had, and literally it would tell you what page you had to have what activity occurring to be the romance novel. It was very formulaic. If you don't believe me about romance novels, by the way, and how they are, go to a used bookstore, pull out a romance novel, take the cover of the book and very gently do this. What's going to happen with the pages? Well, they'll separate in places that have been opened more and read more. Oh my God. Flip it over and go to the pages that have been opened more, and just read those two pages. It's like, oh, smoke, you know? And you don't even have to buy it. You just enjoyed the entirety of the romance novel right there, you know? So there it is. But don't get too high on your horse because if you ever read Nancy Drew or the Hardy Boys or the Bobbsey Twins, Hardy Boys was blue, that was for boys. Nancy Drew, yellow for girls. Bobbsey Twins, purple, so nicely ambiguous, you know. But if you ever read those, weren't they the same book over and over again? But as kids, we thought they were the greatest books ever. By the way, don't ever rewatch anything you enjoyed as a kid. You might find out it was really fucking stupid later on. You know, it'd be very embarrassing. Oh, yes, I have not revisited Speed Racer for many reasons. That would be all of them. But the point is that basically Horatio Alger told the same story in all of his books. That story was of a poor person, usually from the country, sometimes an immigrant, who comes to the city, works for a company, and then what happens? Despite all the obstacles, he will become the head of that company and super rich and super successful. We begin, what do we call that story? What do we call that story, that idea? Okay, the American success story, the American dream, rags to riches, right? All those would be the same, you know, the underdog who makes it big, as you would say. This idea of the American dream, that all you had to do was work hard, and if you came in and worked hard, you would eventually become rich and very wealthy. Is this not a big idea, right, and a big American idea? Now, it's not that we didn't already have some of the information of these ideas in America from the 18th century. We did. But Horatio Alger popularizes it in a way that just catches fire. His books are republished in multiple different languages in foreign countries. And what's it going to say to immigrants? It's going to say, all you have to do is come over here and work hard, and guess what? You will become rich. Yep, and so this idea, in fact, there was a time, we don't hear it so much anymore because people don't know the Horatio Alger name anymore, but it was very common as a metaphor when somebody would say they were an American success story, they would call somebody that they were a Horatio Alger story. That phrase, the Horatio Alger story, becomes synonymous with the American dream, the American success story. And what it's going to do is it's going to create a lot of things. One, of course, it's going to encourage immigration tremendously. It's going to create a big drive for immigration to come to the United States because it's going to say, look, all you have to do is work hard, you come here and you'll become successful and go back home wealthy.
Did Andrew Carnegie?
Well, we'll talk about that in a second. Okay, in fact, actually, he's up on our list too. But there's actually something else that it's going to do. But frequently, we tend to kind of simplistically talk about the 19th century as being the late 19th century, this industrial period, as being a tension between the rich people and the poor people, between owners and labor. But there's much more complicated things, because what we're going to see is also a tension between what we might call old money or old wealth and new money. Because what's happening? If you think about going back to England, in the old days of England and in the old parts of the United States, was it shameful to inherit your money, or was that a good thing? It's a good thing. You're from a noble family. You're from a very well-to-do tradition. The idea of inheriting money, being part of the blue bloods, right? You know, being part of one of those almost aristocratic families, that was a good thing.
It was like being in your status.
Right, that you had instant status. But what happens when we move to the industrial age? With this emphasis on the American dream, the American success story, whom do we admire more? People who have inherited their wealth, or people who start with nothing and make their wealth? Yeah. This idea of new money, this idea of somebody who starts with nothing. A Horatio Alger story becomes extraordinarily important as a narrative. I mean, let's just compare. Think about how we think like a Bill Gates or a Steve Jobs. These are people we admire. We say, okay, we might not like all the things that they did, but we say, holy shit, that's quintessential American success story, right? Compare that to how we treat inherited wealth, like somebody like Paris Hilton. Okay? Do we take her very seriously? No, for good reason. Okay? But so, I mean, that's the emblem of how we in America. Now, for example, what this means is that politicians and the robber barons of this period, they're all going to say that they were all new money. They're all going to say that they were self-made men, that none of them actually had been on the back burner, that instead that they were all ones that came from nothing. Now, is this true that most of these guys came from nothing and had no money to begin with? No. Actually, many of them were very well-to-do. Some of them actually were Civil War profiteers, and that was kind of cool. I guess that's kind of like, you know, building yourself up from criminal background. That's cool, okay. But some were, but most were not, okay. But then old money is going to have some critiques of new money as well. Because, and this is where a fracture is occurring, because there's a problem. People who had inherited wealth, particularly a lot of, because the southern planters are gone, as we talked about in an earlier lecture, that means that it's mostly these northeastern blue blood families, these aristocratic blue blood families of the north. They're going to be very critical of new money. And what are they going to say is the good thing about old money and what makes new money bad? Why are new money people not good?
Lower class.
Okay, what about that? What do we have as old money that they do not have? Class, sophistication. We are the keepers of culture and the arts and dignity and civility. And this new money, you know, they're Johnny-come-lately. They're not really noble. They're uneducated and unsophisticated. Okay. Now, so one of the things that we tend to forget is even though that we tend to postulate this industrial period as being very wealthy versus the very poor, and it's not that there's not that stress there. Sure, But there's also, there's obviously, when we talk about labor, are all labor people gonna get along? Are all workers gonna be happy little workers and all work? No. As we're gonna talk about with immigration, there's fights in between them. And there's fights between the upper tier too, okay? It's a much more complex picture than we sometimes simplistically allow.